Why you wouldn't last 24 hours in medieval dungeon. Think prison today is rough? Think again. In the medieval world, jail wasn't a punishment. It was a death sentence with a slow timer. No trial, no problem. You could be chained up in a pitch-black pit, swarmed by rats screaming alongside the dying, all before anyone asked what you were accused of. And here's the kicker. You didn't have to be a murderer to end up there. Steal a loaf of bread, insult a noble, or just be poor at the wrong time. Boom. Dungeon. This video tears down the Hollywood myths and dives headfirst into the brutal, rotting, soul-crushing nightmare that was a medieval dungeon. You'll learn how the system didn't fail because it was never meant to be fair, how torture wasn't the exception, it was the routine, and how even mercy could destroy you. One twist might leave you speechless. The most terrifying part of dungeon life wasn't the chains, or the beatings, or even the torture. It was what happened after they let you go. Imagine getting locked inside a porta-potty during the peak of summer. Now remove the air, kill the light, and add some starving rats. Congrats, you've just entered your first hour in a medieval dungeon. Hollywood might show dungeons as musty rooms with chains and torches. Reality? 1,000 times worse. And you didn't even need to commit murder to end up there. Petty theft, unpaid taxes, even mouthing off to the wrong guy? Welcome to hell. The first thing that hit you was the smell. It wasn't something you got used to. Human waste, vomit, rot, and thick humidity soaked every inch of the stone walls. In some urban dungeons, like the one at Warwick Castle, even guards gagged. The air was worse than a modern sewer, and you had to breathe it. For hours, sometimes for weeks. Then came the space, or lack of it. Some cells were barely 2 square meters. No bed, no straw, no bucket. Just cold stone and maybe a rusted shackle bolted to the floor. If it rained, you were soaked. If it snowed, you froze. In summer, the heat was unbearable. But always, it was dark. Not dim, pitch black. The kind of darkness that made you lose track of time, of space, of yourself. Without light, your brain begins to short circuit. Modern research proves total light deprivation causes hallucinations, panic, and time distortion within 24 hours. In medieval times, this wasn't a design flaw, it was the whole point. The faster you lost your grip on reality, the faster you cracked. That wasn't a bug. That was the strategy. And cracking didn't mean telling the truth. It meant saying whatever the jailer wanted to hear. You might hope for peace in the silence. Forget it. Medieval dungeons weren't solo accommodations. You shared your cell with other prisoners, and sometimes even corpses. The screams of the tortured, the prayers of the dying, the hacking coughs of the sick, and the scraping of rats. It never stopped. In one Bavarian castle, archaeologists found claw marks on the cell walls. People literally tried to dig their way out with their fingernails. Modern solitary confinement is considered psychological torture after 15 days. In the Middle Ages, that was just the intro round. And don't forget the unwanted guests. Lice, fleas, bedbugs, and rats. The infestations were so bad that prisoners were often covered in infected bite wounds. French records from the 1200s even mention inmates eating rats because there was nothing else. And food? A joke, when it came at all. A crust of stale bread and a cup of watery broth per day if you were lucky. Guards would often toss it onto the filthy floor. You'd have to crawl for it, fighting bugs for every bite. If you didn't eat, you starved. Many prisoners dropped to under 90 pounds within a month. And if that didn't kill you, the diseases did. Dysentery, typhus, even gangrene from untreated wounds. Let's talk guards. They weren't peacekeepers. They were predators. Bribes ran the place. If you had money, you got food, light, maybe a blanket. No money, no mercy. And that included how much pain you got. Torture wasn't a punishment. It was part of the daily routine. And there was a whole menu to choose from. Forget the myth of the Iron Maiden. It's likely a later invention. But the rack was very real. Stretching someone until tendons snapped and joints dislocated was standard practice. The strappado, where you were hoisted by your wrists tied behind your back, often broke shoulders instantly. One English account from 1423 describes a man's ribs cracking from tension on the rack. That wasn't the execution, that was just pre-trial interrogation. Because trials weren't about truth. You were usually guilty the moment you got arrested. The confession extracted through torture was treated as evidence. You were damned the moment you screamed. Legal representation? Please. Lawyers were a luxury for nobles. The best you got was a priest to pray for your soul. Your body? Disposable. In Florence's infamous Bargello prison, there was a room known as the Whispering Chamber. Prisoners could hear others being tortured but couldn't see anything. That psychological torment, waiting, listening, imagining often, drove inmates to madness before a single finger was laid on them. And that was intentional. Fear was the most efficient tool in the box. Now compare that to today. Even maximum security prisons offer light, food, sanitation, and legal protections. Back then, a guy who stole bread could be thrown into a hole with no exit, tortured until he confessed to crimes he didn't commit, and rot away without a soul noticing, all documented, all deliberate. Not medieval chaos, medieval order. Torture wasn't an exception, it was the rule. And it wasn't about justice, it was about control. Fear kept society in line. In 15th century Burgundy, some prisoners actually begged for execution rather than stay another day underground. Not because death was noble, but because it was faster. Sometimes even that final mercy was delayed. Condemned prisoners could be kept alive for weeks after sentencing left to fester as a public warning. Execution became an act of kindness, a release. In this system, death was rehabilitation. There's an English chronicle that tells of a thief who bit off his own tongue to avoid being sent to Newgate prison. He preferred bleeding out in the street to stepping foot in that dungeon. That's what these places did. They didn't just break the body. They erased the self. And all it took to end up there? Insulting the wrong noble, failing to pay taxes, or getting accused by someone richer? Justice wasn't blind. It was for sale. No coin, no chance. And the dungeon was always open for business. So imagine all that crammed into just 24 hours. The smell, the dark, the screams, the filth, the hunger, the pain. You wouldn't need a week to collapse. One night could ruin you, or end you. And here's the twist. For many, that was just the warm-up. Because when the jailer unlocked your cell and said, "Your day has come," that's when the real nightmare began. The door creaks open, and in comes the light brief, blinding, and unwelcome. It's not freedom. It's the next round. Chains rattle. The guard doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. You're dragged out, knees raw, eyes swollen from days or maybe weeks of darkness. There's no time to adjust. You're already on the move, toward a room that smells worse than your cell. A place where screams echo longer. The torture chamber. It wasn't a myth. It wasn't rare. It was business as usual. Torture wasn't just punishment. It was administration. It kept the wheels of justice turning. Inquisition courts used it. Secular courts used it. Lords and bishops alike had their own specialists. And there wasn't just one method. There were dozens, each tailored to a particular confession, body type, or crime. It was a twisted science of pain, refined over centuries. The iron boot crushed bones slowly. The thumbscrew splintered fingers like twigs. The pear of anguish, a device inserted into mouths or other orifices, expanded until tissue tore. The rack stretched ligaments past their limit. But the worst? The strappado. Arms tied behind your back, hoisted up by a rope, then dropped. Not far. Just enough. The sudden jerk dislocated shoulders instantly. If they liked you, they only did it once. If they didn't, they did it until you begged to talk. But talking didn't help, because they weren't listening for truth. They were listening for agreement. They had a script. You just had to stick to it. Deny it. They kept going. Confess too quickly, they'd say you were holding back. The sweet spot was breaking down and sobbing, detailed, theatrical surrender. That was the performance they needed. Once you gave it, you weren't saved. You were simply moved to the next phase. Some prisoners were tortured for days without trial. Some never made it to trial at all. The line between investigation and punishment blurred constantly. In 14th century France, inquisitors kept people chained in wet pits for weeks, then interrogated them without ever logging a single charge. In England, the Star Chamber thrived on silence. No defense attorneys, no jury, just interrogation enhanced by mechanical persuasion. And who did the torturing? Not wild-eyed madmen. Trained professionals, paid by the crown, the church, or the city. They had tools. They had assistants. They kept records. Some even kept journals. In Spain, certain torturers detailed how many turns of the rack it took for a merchant to confess to smuggling. Not theft, smuggling. That was enough to qualify for body destruction. Women weren't spared. In fact, some methods were specially adapted. Breast rippers, iron spiders, and the so-called witch pricker targeted female bodies with surgical cruelty. And once accused of witchcraft, a woman was in a legal black hole. Her innocence wasn't just doubted, it was inverted. The more she protested, the guiltier she looked. And if she stayed silent, that was guilt too. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Torture had a theater to it, a rhythm. You weren't just isolated, you were watched. Not by crowds, but by notaries, guards, and sometimes nobles. Spectacle didn't need an audience. It just needed someone with power enjoying your pain. Confessions were documented in Latin, then translated into the vernacular for court. The tortured words of peasants became polished legal text. Blood turned into bureaucracy. After the interrogation, you might get relief back to your dungeon cell. But your body wasn't the same. Dislocated joints didn't heal in the dark. Open wounds festered. Medieval medicine in prisons was non-existent. If you were lucky, a fellow inmate might spit on a rag and tie it around your arm. If not, infection did its slow, grim work. And if you died, you were dragged out, dumped in a common pit. No rights, no records, just erased. It wasn't just physical. The psychological erosion was endless. The mind doesn't cope well with unpredictability. You never knew when pain would come. You didn't know what they'd do next. There was no schedule, no bedtime, no light, no sound but suffering. This wasn't just punishment. It was erosion of self, of reality. You became a body in a hole that forgot it had a name. Even outside the torture chamber, pressure kept building. Food grew scarcer, temperature more brutal. In winter, the frost turned toes black. In summer, skin blistered and split. Water was either contaminated or rationed, and death came in subtle ways. Dehydration, sepsis, tetanus. One misstep, one wound, one bite from an infected rat, and that was it. You rotted in place, and yet the system endured. Maintained by scribes, sanctioned by bishops, enforced by men in uniform. Torture was paperwork. Dungeons were line items in budgets. In Paris, the Stellet prison had full-time staff, regular inventories, and monthly reports. It was all tracked, all formal. You were just one more case number chained to a wall forgotten by the world. One letter from a 15th century Italian prisoner survives. Smuggled out under a bowl of food, it reads, "They want me to say I kissed the devil. I have never seen him. But if I stay here longer, I may." That wasn't metaphor. That was mental collapse. Torture didn't extract truth. It fabricated it. And the system didn't care. Back outside, the world moved on. Festivals continued. Lords hunted. Merchants haggled. No one cared what happened beneath the cobblestones. Out of sight, out of mind. The dungeon was the state's dirty secret, and everyone was complicit in pretending it didn't exist. And if someone asked too many questions, they got a cell of their own. Silence was contagious. Even escape was a lie. Stories of prisoners tunneling out or bribing guards were vanishingly rare. One man in 13th century Prague tried to dig through the wall with a spoon. He made it 5 inches before being discovered and flayed. His skin was nailed to the door as a warning. There was no out, only through. And through often meant trial by ordeal. If torture didn't produce a usable confession, they might drag you into the public square and test you divinely. Walk across burning iron, carry boiling water, be dunked in rivers and wait to sink. If you lived, you were innocent. If not, well, guess you were guilty. Either way, you were ruined. That was the logic. It was airtight. But the worst part? You started to believe it. After days or weeks of pain and darkness, something cracked. The voice in your head changed. Maybe you did commit heresy. Maybe you were a witch. Maybe you deserved this. Medieval dungeons didn't just house bodies. They manufactured guilt. Because the system wasn't built to find truth. It was built to reinforce authority, to make people disappear, to turn whispers into monsters and fear into obedience. And for every inmate who screamed, 100 others stayed silent outside the walls, terrified of ending up inside. You weren't a person anymore. You were a lesson, a warning, a grotesque example carved into flesh, and your cell didn't need a name. Everyone already knew what it meant. Don't steal, don't question, don't resist, or you'll end up here, with the rest of the forgotten. And all of that? Still only day 1. because if you were still breathing by sunrise, they still had more in store. Torture might end, but judgment was coming. And in the medieval world, that word didn't mean justice. It meant reckoning. The sun outside had long risen, but in your world beneath stone and silence, time had ceased to mean anything. You didn't know what day it was. You didn't know if the moans echoing down the corridor were coming from the living or the half-dead. And then, one day, the guard showed up again. But this time, he didn't come alone. There were others, scribes with ink-stained fingers, a local official in robes, maybe even a priest. It was time for your trial. Don't let the word fool you. A medieval trial was less courtroom, more performance. No jury, no impartiality. In many places, like 14th century France or the Holy Roman Empire, guilt had already been decided the moment you were chained. This was theater, and you were both the villain and the victim. They brought you up still broken from torture, disheveled, trembling, barely able to stand. That was by design. A guilty man looked like that. An innocent man? He didn't survive this far. The court was often held in a chapel or town hall, but whether you were in England, Spain, or the Low Countries, the layout was the same. You stood if you could before men in elevated seats. They questioned you not to discover the truth, but to trap you. Every answer was a minefield. Did you know the accused? Were you at the scene? Have you spoken against the church? One wrong pause and they circled like wolves. If you contradicted your previous confession extracted under torture, that was heresy or perjury. If you stuck to it, it sealed your doom. Heads nodded. Quills scratched. A record was made. You weren't really there to speak. You were there to be seen breaking. And if you protested, if you cried out that you were innocent, that only proved your instability. Defiance was dangerous. Submission was expected. Witnesses? Rarely in your favor. Most were coerced, bribed, or afraid. In some inquisitorial courts, accusers could remain anonymous. You never even knew who had spoken against you. It could be a neighbor, a rival, a noble, or no one at all. Sometimes the accusation itself was fabricated to seize your property or eliminate a threat. Trials were as much political as they were judicial. One record from Cologne in the 13th century describes a merchant who was accused of sorcery after refusing to pay a noble a bribe. Within a week, he was tortured, tried, and condemned, all based on evidence that vanished after his execution. His house was seized, his wife banished, his name erased. That was the real purpose of many trials, not to punish crime, but to redistribute power. Even sentencing had its own layers of cruelty. You could be declared guilty, but not executed. Instead, you might face branding, public whipping, or exile, or you could be sent back to the dungeon to await execution for weeks, even months. This limbo was its own form of torment. Hope kept you alive just long enough to prolong the suffering. And if you clung to hope too tightly, it only hurt more when the final blow came. Sometimes they'd offer you a deal. Confess again, publicly this time, and you might be granted a merciful death decapitation instead of burning. Refuse, and they'd make it slow. The authorities liked obedience, even in death. A broken man who praised the court before the crowd served as a living endorsement of their divine authority. A defiant one? That was dangerous. Rebellious words could echo longer than screams. Inquisitors particularly feared martyrs. That's why they aimed not just to kill, but to erase. Records altered, graves unmarked, families shamed. The punishment extended beyond the individual. It spread like rot through community and kin. A daughter of a condemned heretic couldn't marry. A son couldn't inherit. A neighbor couldn't trade. Guilt became hereditary. Whole villages learned. Don't associate, don't question, don't remember. Public executions were choreographed displays. They weren't just justice, they were propaganda. The entire town would gather, sometimes by force. Children on shoulders, merchants pausing trade, clergy delivering sermons from makeshift pulpits. The condemned was paraded through the streets, often in rags, sometimes with signs listing their sins. Stones were thrown. Spit flew. The crowd wasn't always angry. Sometimes they were just afraid. Better to blend in than to be accused of sympathy. Execution methods varied. Hanging was common for thieves, beheading for nobles if they were lucky. Burning was reserved for heretics and witches. But there were worse fates. Breaking on the wheel meant bones shattered methodically while the victim was strapped to a giant cartwheel. Impalement was rare but documented in Eastern Europe. And for traitors, dismemberment was not unheard of. It wasn't just about ending life, it was about sending a message that stuck. Take 15th century England. In one case, a man accused of coin clipping, a form of currency fraud, was boiled alive. Not in oil, in water. Slowly. So the crowd could watch his skin peel and his screams stretch into hoarse gurgles. That wasn't judicial efficiency. That was performance. Fear made people obedient. Obedience made rulers sleep easy. But even after the execution, the punishment didn't end. Bodies were often displayed heads on spikes, limbs nailed to gates, torsos left to rot. The elements and carrion birds did the rest. This served a dual purpose: terror for the living and spiritual annihilation for the dead. A body denied burial was believed by many to wander as a restless spirit. In a deeply religious age, that was more than humiliation. It was eternal damnation. And what of your cellmates, still breathing, still waiting? They saw everything, heard the crowd, smelled the smoke. They knew what was coming for them. Sometimes guards would taunt them by describing in graphic detail the fate of the last prisoner. He screamed like a pig. She begged for her mother. Hope wasn't just crushed, it was weaponized. In this system, despair wasn't a side effect. It was the goal. Survivors of these dungeons were rare. Those who emerged broken but alive were often marked physically and socially. A missing tongue, a burned cheek, a limp from shattered knees. No one hired them. Few spoke to them. They were reminders of what could happen. Walking warnings, living ghosts. And if somehow someone made it out unscathed, perhaps pardoned by a lord or proven innocent by miracle, they weren't free. They were watched. They were tracked. They were often required to pay fines for their own imprisonment. Imagine being jailed, tortured, and then billed for the privilege. It happened. More than once. Records from late medieval Bruges detail prisoners released under royal pardon who were still required to reimburse their jailers for food and chains. One man died in debtor's prison just a year after being freed. In truth, no one really left the dungeon. Not mentally, not legally, not spiritually. Once inside, you were marked forever. Some turned to religion, others to madness. Many simply disappeared into the margins of society, living as beggars, outcasts, or vagabonds. The system had no use for damaged goods. And the rest of the world? It preferred not to see. Easier that way. Safer. Yet despite all this, the dungeon system endured. It wasn't broken. It worked exactly as intended. It silenced dissent. It extracted confessions. It reinforced hierarchy. Lords ruled. Priests judged. Peasants obeyed. And when they didn't, the dungeon waited. And if you were still alive after your trial, if you hadn't yet met the executioner, there was still one more twist. The system had one last card to play. Mercy. A chance at penance. At redemption. At life, but only if you were willing to surrender everything that made you you. Your beliefs, your body, your past. Would you take it? Because by now, even that sounded better than the alternative. But the price of mercy in the medieval world? That was a torment all its own. You didn't hear the word mercy. It was whispered, not announced. It wasn't offered openly like some lifeline, it was dangled like bait. A rumor, a possibility, passed from cell to cell, from broken prisoner to hopeful husk. But eventually, someone, a guard, a priest, a scribe, leaned in and said it. If you repent, if you submit, if you give everything, maybe you can live. At first, you're suspicious. Of course you are. Everything so far has been lies, traps, and agony. Why would this be any different? But then, after enough nights without sleep and enough hours staring at stone, you start to consider it. What does everything really mean? Your name? Your innocence? Your loyalty? What if you surrender it all? Can you finally step out of this nightmare? Medieval mercy wasn't compassion. It was conversion, submission, a public act of obedience. In religious cases, that meant confession, penance, and public shame. For civil crimes, it meant public humiliation, forfeiture of all property, and often permanent exile. In both, it meant being remade in the image of obedience, a puppet whose strings could be yanked whenever the rulers needed an example. Let's say you accepted. Let's say you confessed publicly. You fell to your knees, kissed the floor, thanked your tormentors, and praised the system that broke you. That was just the beginning. Because before you were allowed to leave, you had to perform your guilt, publicly. Rituals of repentance were elaborate. In some places, you were paraded barefoot through the streets, wearing a sackcloth robe, a rope around your neck, and a placard listing your crimes. People jeered, children threw dung, clergy walked beside you, chanting prayers. You weren't a person anymore, you were a symbol, a warning in motion. The medieval idea of justice was never hidden behind closed doors. It thrived on public performance. Your humiliation wasn't collateral damage. It was the purpose. And when you arrived at the cathedral steps or the town square, you often had to read or hear someone read a confession you didn't write, filled with details you didn't provide, admitting to acts you didn't commit. That document would be entered into permanent record. In some cities, it would be posted on the walls. In others, it would be archived by the church for future use. You were now officially guilty, forever. But wait, you weren't done. Mercy required sacrifice, literally. Everything you owned, money, land, tools, clothes, sometimes even your children, was seized, either by the crown, the church, or your accuser. In the case of religious trials, property was often donated to fund new monasteries or pay for masses for your lost soul. You walked away with nothing but your breath. If you were lucky, you weren't branded. If you weren't, you got a hot iron to the cheek, shoulder, or forehead, a permanent mark of shame. Branded criminals couldn't hold jobs, couldn't marry freely, couldn't re-enter society. You were free in name only. In practice, you were still chained, just by different means. In some towns, branded criminals were forced to live in designated slums or outside city walls. These were not communities. They were holding pens for the human refuse of the justice system. No walls, no guards, no protection. Just other broken men and women scraping together scraps of survival. And if crime happened there, and it did, it was ignored. After all, what justice did the damned deserve? Others were exiled entirely, given a fixed number of days to leave the city or territory and never return. No one helped you. You walked. If you were caught inside the boundary after your deadline, the sentence was death, usually quick, sometimes not. Exiles rarely made it far. With no money, no support, and physical damage from their time inside, they often died on the road or were killed by bandits, or worse, taken in by mercenaries or slavers. One account from 15th century Poland describes a former prisoner who was exiled with his family, only to be captured and enslaved by a traveling band of soldiers. They sold him south to work in salt mines, where he lasted 3 months before collapsing. His wife died on the road. His children were never seen again. That was mercy. But perhaps the cruelest fate of all was for those allowed to stay, those marked, shamed, and forced to live among the same people who once called them neighbors. They were watched, mocked, feared. Employers refused them. Churches made them kneel at the back. Even fellow peasants avoided eye contact. And the system knew this. It wasn't blind. It counted on shame to finish what the chains had started. Sometimes the church offered sanctuary, but only under strict conditions. You could live in a monastery courtyard, sweep floors, eat scraps, and pray. You couldn't leave. You couldn't speak freely. You were cloistered, in all but name. Monastic exile. It was safer than the streets, but no less confining. A different dungeon. One with hymns instead of screams. A few former prisoners wrote about their experiences. Not many. Literacy was rare, and survivors rarer. But a 14th century Frenchman named Hugues de Thiers left behind a fragmented account. He spoke of forgetting the sound of wind, of dreaming about walls, of flinching at sudden noises for the rest of his life. The dungeon, he said, wasn't a place, it was a presence. It followed him, even into sleep. For others, the only way out was to become what had hurt them. Some became informants. Some became guards. A few even joined the ranks of inquisitors. Once you'd been destroyed and rebuilt, it was easier to serve the system than fight it. And sometimes the only way to feel powerful again was to become someone else's nightmare. And here lies the final twist. The system didn't just crush people. It recycled them, turned victims into tools, pain into policy. The dungeon wasn't just a pit. It was a factory. A place where the machinery of control ground away at souls, spat out bodies, and kept rolling. And every cog was shaped by fear, because fear was the fuel of the medieval world. Not faith, not law, fear. And nothing fed that fear like the thought of waking up back in that hole. back in the dark, back in the stink and silence with nothing but stone and screams for company. Once you'd been there, you never truly left. And everyone else lived with the terror that they could be next. The dungeons were never empty. There was always someone to accuse, always someone to silence, always someone to make an example of. And so the cycle continued, quiet, invisible, relentless. The walls remembered, the chains waited, and the system endured. Because in a world ruled by power, obedience, and control, there was always room for one more prisoner, one more confession, one more broken body to keep the rest in line. And mercy? Mercy was just another form of punishment, the kind that let you live, long enough to suffer the memory. They called it justice, but what it really was control. And control required examples, public, vivid, unforgettable examples. So even when you were spared death, even when you walked away broken but breathing, the world never let you forget. The dungeon might have loosened its grip on your wrists, but it still held your name, your story, your very identity. You weren't just someone who survived a medieval prison. You were the proof that the system worked, and a walking warning that it could reach anyone. Cities used you. You were a reminder that obedience wasn't optional. Your scarred body told a story without you ever opening your mouth. Markets paused when you passed. Neighbors whispered. Even if they pitied you, they never stood too close. After all, who wanted to be next? Guilt by association was real, and the line between suspicion and conviction was paper thin, often literally a single anonymous letter. In some places, survivors of the dungeon were legally labeled as marked persons. Their names appeared in public ledgers. They had curfews. They couldn't carry weapons. They couldn't testify in court, even if they witnessed a murder. The state had decided they were liars, untrustworthy, permanently tainted. Redemption didn't exist. Rehabilitation was never the goal. Only submission and silence. And for many, silence became the only option. Speaking about what had happened could land you right back where you started. Questioning the verdict, heresy, describing the torture, slander, naming your torturer, treason. The law didn't protect you. It protected itself. The church and the crown had long mastered the art of circular logic. If you endured, you were guilty. If you died, you were even guiltier. That's why so much of what we know about medieval dungeons comes not from survivors, but from observers, foreign diplomats, critical monks, the occasional whistleblowing clerk. One 14th century Italian monk wrote in his secret journal that he trembled at the screams heard beneath the sacristy, but knew better than to speak aloud. He buried the pages in a wall. They were found centuries later, brittle but legible, telling truths no one dared voice at the time. But sometimes, cracks formed. A local lord grew tired of Inquisition overreach. A reformer within the clergy gained followers. A town rose up not with pitchforks, but with records, protests, testimony. In rare moments, a dungeon was shut down, the doors flung open, prisoners freed, chains removed. It felt like a miracle. But even then, justice was never offered. There were no reparations, no apologies, just a shifting of the system to quieter corners. Some who were freed fled immediately, taking nothing but the clothes on their backs and the trauma they could never wash off. Others stayed and tried to rebuild. They married if they could. They worked where they were allowed. Some became folk legends, cautionary tales told to children. Mind your tongue or you'll end up like old Jarek, the one-eyed baker who once defied the taxman. These stories weren't celebrations. They were reminders of the edge everyone lived on. And that edge was real. Because for most people in medieval Europe, daily life already balanced on a knife's point. Famine, plague, war. You didn't need to break the law to end up in chains. You just had to be in the wrong place, owe the wrong person, speak at the wrong moment. Justice wasn't a process, it was a privilege. If you were poor or foreign or different, the dungeon was always closer than you thought. Even the architecture reminded you. Town squares had gibbets where bones still clung to rusted cages. Castle walls had narrow, dark holes that everyone knew were holding cells. Some churches even had underground rooms not for relics, but for prisoners of God's wrath. Children grew up seeing these places. They didn't question them. They absorbed them, as natural as clouds or trees. Fear was inherited. And yet, in the most brutal irony, many still believed in the system. They believed the dungeons kept evil at bay, that witches were real, that heresy was infectious, that pain saved souls. They believed because it was safer than doubting. Belief, after all, kept you out of the hole. Doubt might drag you in. This belief system was reinforced constantly from the pulpit, from the guards, from the chants of public trials. Pain purifies. Confession saves. Mercy belongs to the righteous. It didn't matter that mercy rarely came. The words mattered more than the truth. And after years, decades, centuries of repetition, the people no longer needed to be forced to comply. They complied themselves. The threat of the dungeon lived inside them. Still, every now and then, something snapped. A woman refused to repent. A man broke his chains. A town sheltered a fugitive. These moments were rare, dangerous, and often ended in tragedy. But they mattered. They lit sparks. They reminded others that the dungeon was not ordained by God, but built by men. And what men build, men can unbuild. One of the most remarkable revolts happened in Flanders in the late 1300s. A group of townsfolk stormed the local bailiff's prison and released every inmate inside, some guilty, most not. The authorities cracked down hard. Dozens were executed, but the memory lingered. In that town, for a brief time, the dungeon lost its grip. And memory, no matter how fragile, was its own kind of resistance. But for every story like that, there were 100 that ended in darkness. Chains that never came off. Names that disappeared from record. Bones that turned to dust in forgotten corners of stone chambers. The medieval dungeon wasn't just a place, it was an outcome. A sentence not always written down, but always felt. And even when the actual cells fell into ruin, their legacy remained. Prisons didn't disappear. They evolved. From castle keeps to debtors' prisons, from ecclesiastical torture rooms to Enlightenment-era asylums. The logic carried forward. Isolate, punish, break, reform. The methods shifted. The philosophy remained. Today we look back and shudder. We shake our heads at the cruelty, the injustice, the absurdity of confessing to witchcraft under duress or being branded for stealing a loaf of bread. But how different are we, really? We still believe systems are infallible, still assume guilt based on appearance, status, or fear, still tolerate suffering so long as it's hidden, sanitized, renamed. The medieval dungeon wasn't a mistake of history. It was a tool, a mirror, a warning. And if we don't remember what it did, how it worked, what it broke, we risk building it again. Not with stone and chain, but with silence and policy. Not underground, but in plain sight. Fear, after all, doesn't need a cell. It just needs obedience. And those who once survived that darkness, if they could speak across time, they wouldn't ask for pity. They'd ask us to see the weight of unchecked power, to see the humanity in those forgotten, to see that the worst prisons are not built from stone, but from the belief that some lives don't matter. Because the real question isn't whether you would survive 24 hours in a medieval dungeon. The real question is, would you even realize you were in one? Or would you call it justice like everyone else? So could you last 24 hours in a medieval dungeon? Probably not. Most didn't. And those who did never came out the same. What we call torture today was daily policy back then. Mercy wasn't kindness. It was another kind of control. And justice? That was just a performance for the powerful. But here's the real gut punch. Maybe the scariest thing isn't how far we've come, but how close we still are. Systems that crush the poor, prisons that erase people, punishments masked as rehabilitation. Sound familiar? What do you think? Would the average person today even recognize they're trapped if the dungeon came dressed as policy and paperwork? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Could you survive the system? If you found this journey eye-opening, brutal, or just plain unbelievable, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We're just getting started.